Queen Alora's escape pod tumbled through the vastness of space, spinning wildly as flames licked its metal surface. The pod was battered, its outer shell glowing bright red as it hurtled toward an unknown planet. Inside, Alora, the queen of the Chilean Empire, struggled to keep her consciousness intact. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body aching from the fierce battle she had barely survived. The enemy forces had attacked without warning, their ships cutting through the skies and firing mercilessly at her vessel. Alora's elite guards had fought bravely but were overwhelmed one by one. Now she was alone, drifting in the cold emptiness of space. The sound of alarms blaring in her ears was the only noise she could hear, except for the rush of her ragged breath. She had been strong once, ruling over countless star systems, commanding fleets of ships and armies of soldiers. But now, in the dark confines of this crumbling escape pod, she was nothing more than a queen in exile, vulnerable and weak. The harsh, shaking movements of the pod made her grip the seat tighter, her vision blurring with each violent twist. The pod entered the planet's atmosphere with a jolt so violent that it sent a sharp pain through Alora's chest. Heat flooded the small space as red warning lights flashed on the console before her. She tried pressing buttons, her hands trembling as she attempted to stabilize the descent. Nothing worked. The pod continued to fall, spiraling toward the surface below. The heat intensified and Alora braced herself for impact. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar sense of helplessness. The queen who once commanded armies was now at the mercy of a random planet, her fate in the hands of fate itself. In her last moments of consciousness, she whispered to herself, "Please let me survive." The pod crashed violently through thick clouds, its exterior cracking under the force. Trees and branches whipped past the windows, snapping and cracking, as the pod continued its chaotic descent. The ground grew nearer, and Alora's body slammed against the sides of the pod as it hit the earth with a bone-jarring force. The world around her went dark. Hours passed before Alora stirred. The pain shot through her body like 1,000 needles, each movement a struggle. Her silver-blue skin was cut and bruised, and her breath was shallow. She could feel the weight of her body pressing against the cold, hard surface of the pod. Her mind was foggy, and for a moment she wondered if she had finally succumbed to death. But the air was different here, heavier, but breathable. Alora forced her eyes open, blinking against the light as her senses returned. She was alive, but stranded. The planet she had fallen to was unlike any world she had ever seen. Tall trees stretched far above her, their thick branches casting long shadows over the wreckage. Strange sounds filled the air, chirping, rustling, and the distant calls of creatures she couldn't yet understand. She pressed a button on her wrist device, hoping for a signal, but the screen flickered weakly before going dark. The distress signal had failed her. Her empire had no way of knowing where she was. She was alone, stranded on a primitive world with no hope of rescue. Frustration burned inside her. She had been a queen, a ruler of the stars. How had she fallen so low? Sharp sound broke through her thoughts. Footsteps, slow, careful, and getting closer. Her heart raced in her chest as she reached for her energy blade, only to find it missing, lost in the crash. Weak and defenseless, she prepared herself to fight with her hands if necessary. The footsteps stopped just outside the pod. She could feel the presence of whoever had approached, their eyes studying her. The hatch of the pod creaked open, and bright sunlight flooded in. Alora blinked, her vision adjusting to the sudden glare. Standing before her was not an armored soldier, nor an alien hunter. It was something else. A human. He was tall, with strong arms and a rough, bearded face. His clothes were simple, fabric and animal hides. His eyes, a deep brown, studied her with curiosity, not fear. He had no advanced weapons, only a crude knife strapped to his belt. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither moving. Alora's mind raced. Humans. She had studied many species, but they were barely considered noteworthy in the grand order of the galaxy. Their technology was primitive, their civilization young, yet here one stood before her, having found her when the elite soldiers of her empire had failed. The human stepped closer, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "You okay?" he asked, his voice deep, cautious. Alora narrowed her eyes. She didn't understand his language, but the tone in his voice was clear. Concern, not hostility. The pain in her side flared up again, and she tried to push herself up, but dizziness overtook her. The world spun, and before she could react, the human reached out, catching her before she fell. His hands were warm, rough, and steady, and though she wanted to push him away, to demand that he leave her, her body betrayed her. She was too weak. With surprising gentleness, the human lifted her from the wreckage and carried her away from the crash site. Queen Alora, ruler of the stars, had no choice but to trust a primitive human. As the sun dipped behind the trees, he carried her deeper into the unknown world, where her survival and her fate would depend on someone she had never imagined would be her savior. The human's strong arms held Queen Alora as he walked steadily through the dense forest. Each step seemed to send jolts of pain through her body, but she could not find the strength to protest. She was weak, and though she hated it, she had no choice but to rely on him. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the strange turn of events. Only hours ago, she had been the queen of the mighty Chilean Empire, commanding fleets of ships and legions of soldiers. Now she was being carried by a human, someone she had always thought insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The forest around them was thick with towering trees and lush vegetation. Strange, bright-colored flowers dotted the ground, and the air smelled of earth and something unfamiliar, something sweet and pungent at the same time. The sounds of wildlife echoed around them, and Alora's sharp ears caught the distant chirping of creatures she couldn't identify. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The planet felt primitive, almost untouched by the advanced technologies of the galaxy. It was a place where time moved slowly, where the hustle and bustle of interstellar life seemed far away. The human, whose name was still unknown to her, moved with ease through the forest. His steps were confident, unhurried, as though he had walked these paths his entire life. Alora felt the muscles in his arms shift with each movement, his grip firm but careful as he cradled her in his arms. Despite her condition, she couldn't help but notice the raw strength in him. His body was not sculpted like the warriors of her empire, but there was an undeniable power in his every move. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he had helped her, but the words were stuck in her throat. It was hard enough to admit she needed help. To trust a human of all creatures was something she could not easily do. Yet as they walked deeper into the forest, Alora realized that there was something different about this human, something she couldn't quite place. It was not fear in his eyes when he looked at her, not awe or even the usual respect that came with her title. There was only curiosity, a quiet understanding that spoke more than any words could. After what felt like hours, the human finally stopped at the edge of a small clearing. There, nestled between the trees, was a cabin, simple yet sturdy, built from logs and stones. Smoke curled up from the chimney, filling the air with the smell of burning wood. A small stream bubbled nearby, its clear waters reflecting the light of the setting sun. The human pushed open the wooden door with his foot and carried her inside. The interior was as primitive as the outside, filled with simple wooden furniture and shelves stocked with basic supplies. There were no advanced machines, no technology to speak of, only the bare essentials. Alora's eyes scanned the room, taking in the rough-hewn furniture and the faint scent of earth that seemed to linger in the air. It was a stark contrast to the palaces and cities she had once ruled, with their gleaming technology and luxurious comforts. This was a world that had not yet touched the stars, a place where survival was about understanding the land and its resources. The human carefully laid her down on a bed made of thick blankets. It wasn't soft, but it was warm, and for the first time since the crash, Alora felt a semblance of comfort. She tried to sit up, but her body refused to obey. Every movement brought a new wave of pain, and she gritted her teeth, trying to push through it. She hated the weakness that had overtaken her. Queens did not lie helpless on crude beds in strange cabins. They ruled, they commanded. Yet here she was, at the mercy of a human she knew nothing about. The human disappeared into another room, leaving her alone for a moment. Alora's thoughts swirled as she lay there, her body aching and her mind unsettled. How had she ended up here, so far from her empire, so far from the life she had once known? She had been invincible, untouchable. Now she was stranded on a primitive planet dependent on someone who had never even seen a starship. After a while, the human returned, carrying a bowl of water and a cloth. He knelt beside her, dipping the cloth into the water before gently pressing it against a wound on her forehead. The coldness of the cloth made her flinch, but she didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his hands steady as he worked. He did not speak, but his presence was reassuring in its own way. "Easy," he said softly, though Alora did not understand the words. His tone was calm, almost soothing, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. She had always been the one to give orders, to dictate the flow of life around her. Now she was at the mercy of this strange human, and yet she didn't feel the fear she expected. There was no hostility in his actions, no desire to harm her. For a brief moment, Alora wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, she had misjudged humans entirely. The human finished cleaning her wound and then sat back on his heels, watching her closely. His eyes held no fear or respect for her title, only a quiet curiosity. It was almost unsettling, this lack of reverence. Alora was used to being treated as royalty, her every word and action scrutinized by those around her. But this human saw her simply as another person in need of help. He placed a cup in her hands, the liquid inside warm and smelling faintly of herbs. Alora hesitated, her instincts warning her not to trust anything from this world. But her throat was dry, and her body weak. With a deep breath, she brought the cup to her lips and took a sip. The taste was bitter. But as the liquid slid down her throat, a warmth spread through her, easing some of the tension in her body. The human watched her, his face unreadable. When she had finished the drink, he stood and moved toward a small wooden shelf, retrieving a small bundle of cloth. He began to roll it up, his movements slow and deliberate. Alora watched him closely, trying to understand his motives. Why was he helping her? What did he want in return? He glanced at her once more before heading toward the door. As he stepped outside, he turned to her with a simple statement. "Rest. You need it." With that, he disappeared into the forest, leaving Alora alone in the cabin. As she lay back on the bed, her mind raced with questions. This human, this stranger, had saved her life. He had offered his help without hesitation, despite the vast differences between their worlds. But why? Was there something more to him than she had assumed? And could she trust him? The night settled in around her, the sounds of the forest filling the air. Alora closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift into a restless sleep. The questions swirling in her mind. Tomorrow she would learn more about this human, and perhaps in time she would learn to trust him. After all, in this strange and unfamiliar world, he was the only one who could help her survive. The following day arrived quietly, the soft light of the sun filtering through the cracks in the wooden cabin. Alora awoke to the sound of birds chirping. Outside, their calls unfamiliar and strange to her ears. For a moment she forgot where she was, her mind still lingering in the haze of sleep. But as the reality of her situation returned, so did the weight of her injuries. She pressed her hand to her side, feeling the bruises and cuts beneath her skin. They were reminders of the battle she had barely survived. But what truly lingered in her mind was the face of the human who had saved her, the man who had cared for her without asking anything in return. Her body still ached, but the pain was more manageable now. The warm drink the human had given her the night before had helped, and her strength was slowly returning. She pushed herself up with a groan, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. The rough blankets beneath her felt strange compared to the luxurious silk she had once slept on in the palace. Yet, there was a certain comfort in the simplicity of it, a stark contrast to the cold, polished perfection of her former life. Alora glanced around the cabin. The space was modest, with a wooden table and chairs, shelves filled with tools and supplies, and a small hearth where a fire crackled softly. There were no advanced technologies here, no systems to monitor her health or status. Everything seemed so primitive. But as her eyes fell on the small pile of logs by the door, she realized that this was the human's world. A world built on survival, on the raw fundamentals of life. A world she had never thought to understand. She heard the door creak open, and the human entered. His name was still unknown to her, though she had learned a little about him the day before. He was a man of few words, and he did not seem to care about her title or her past. He simply saw her as someone in need of help, and that thought alone was disorienting. No one had ever treated her like that before. Not even her closest allies had dared to look beyond her crown. And yet here he was, this stranger who had given her refuge and care without asking anything in return. He carried with him a bundle of freshly chopped wood, his muscles rippling with each movement. His hands were rough from years of hard labor, and his face was weathered, as if life had taught him more than any royal court ever could. Yet there was something in his eyes, something steady and unwavering, that made Alora feel oddly safe. Despite everything that had happened, despite the wreckage of her empire and the uncertainty of her future, she felt an inexplicable trust growing inside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low and calm. There was no fear in his tone, no hesitation, just simple concern. Alora hesitated for a moment before answering. "Better," she said, her voice hoarse but strong. "Thank you." He nodded as if her words meant little to him. "You're welcome, you'll need your strength," he said, placing the wood down beside the hearth. "The forest can be a dangerous place, even for someone like you." His words hung in the air, and Alora found herself surprised. She had assumed that he would be intimidated by her presence, her status. After all, she was a queen, but here he was, speaking to her as if she were no different than anyone else. It was an unsettling thought. She had always been surrounded by people who treated her with reverence, who respected her authority. But this man, this human, did not seem to care about any of that. He saw her as simply another person in need of help. "What's your name?" Alora asked, finally breaking the silence. She had avoided the question for as long as she could, but now she felt it was time to know. After all, he had earned her trust, at least a small part of it. He looked up from the fire, his brow furrowing for a moment as if he were considering her question. Then, with a simple shrug, he answered, "Kyle." Alora nodded, the name settling into her mind. "Kyle," she repeated, trying the sound of it on her tongue. It was simple, unassuming, and yet it carried a weight that no crown could ever match. Kale didn't seem to notice the way Alora's gaze lingered on him. Instead, he reached for the pot on the stove and began to pour water into a nearby bowl. "You should eat," he said, his voice as practical as always. "You won't survive on just rest alone." Alora wanted to protest. She was a queen, after all. She didn't need to be told what to do. But something in the way Kale spoke with such quiet authority made her pause. Perhaps it was because he had done nothing but help her since she had crashed, or perhaps it was the strange sense of security he provided, a sense of calm she had not known in years. "Thank you," she said again, her voice softer this time. She didn't know why she was thanking him. It wasn't just for the food or the water. It was for everything he had done, everything he had given her when she had nothing to offer in return. Kyle didn't respond right away. Instead, he handed her the bowl, his eyes steady and unwavering. There was no judgment in them, no expectations, just a simple understanding, as if he knew exactly what she needed. And for the first time in a long time, Alora felt like she wasn't just a queen. She was a person, someone worthy of care and kindness. As she took the bowl from him, Alora's thoughts drifted back to the night of the crash. The war, the battle, her fleet destroyed, her guards fallen. Everything had seemed so certain back then. She had been a queen, an untouchable ruler. Now she was here, in the middle of an unknown world, with nothing but the help of a stranger to guide her. But as she ate, the warmth of the food filling her body and the strange, comforting presence of Kale beside her, Alora realized that perhaps this was exactly what she needed. Perhaps this fall from grace was a chance to learn something new, something that had been missing from her life all along. "What happened to you?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Why are you here in this forest alone?" Cale paused, his gaze shifting to the window where the light of the sun was slowly fading. "Life's never been kind to me," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight of experience Alora couldn't ignore. "But I've learned how to survive. I live by my own rules now. No one tells me what to do." Alora felt a strange connection to his words. In many ways, her life had been defined by the expectations of others. She had always been the ruler, the leader, the one who had to make decisions for millions. But now, she was just one person, trying to survive in a world that had little use for her crown. "Do you ever regret it?" Alora asked, her voice quieter now. Cale looked at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with a gaze that was not simply practical, but deeply thoughtful. "No," he said. "Surviving is the only thing that matters. Everything else is just a distraction." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Alora didn't know what to say. She had spent her life surrounded by luxury, by power, by expectations. But in Cale's simple words, she began to understand that survival. That was the true measure of strength. As night fell and the cabin grew quieter, Alora knew she was no longer just a queen lost in the stars. She was a woman who had found herself in a world that had nothing to offer her but raw, unfiltered survival. And, in this strange new reality, she might just find the strength to rebuild everything she had lost. The days following Alora's recovery passed quietly. The forest seemed to settle around them. It sounds both comforting and strange. Mornings were filled with the smell of fresh earth and wood smoke, while the evenings brought the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. Cale, always steady and calm, seemed to blend seamlessly into this world. Alora, on the other hand, still struggled to adjust. She had spent her life in the hustle and bustle of courtrooms and battlefields, commanding armies and dictating the fates of entire civilizations. Now, here, she was nothing more than a stranger to this primitive planet, forced to rely on the kindness of a man who had nothing to gain from her survival. Though the pain in her body had mostly faded, Alora's mind still wrestled with the reality of her situation. Her wrist device was still broken, and without it, she had no way of contacting her empire. The wreckage of her escape pod lay scattered in the forest, a testament to her fall from grace. She couldn't help but think of the countless stars she once ruled over, their once proud systems now falling into chaos without her leadership. It was on the 5th day after her arrival that things took a turn. Cale had gone out early, as he always did, to gather supplies from the forest. Alora had spent the morning trying to fix the damaged wrist device, but the task was nearly impossible without the advanced technology she was used to. Still, she persisted, not willing to let it go. Cale's simple tools and his primitive way of life seemed so foreign to her, but she began to understand the necessity of it. Survival was about adapting to your surroundings, about finding solutions when none seemed possible. As the afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, a low hum pierced the air. At first, Alora thought it was the wind or perhaps some creature in the distance, but then it grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. A ship. A ship was approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. The Zordian forces, the enemies who had destroyed her ship and her guards were coming for her. She could feel the familiar tension rising in her chest, the same anxiety she had felt in countless battles before. Only this time, she was vulnerable. She had no army, no fleet, no advanced weapons. She had only herself and Cale. Alora's breath quickened. She reached for the plasma rifle she had salvaged from the Zordian soldiers, a weapon she barely understood but could use in a pinch. She tested its weight, the cool metal against her fingertips, and quickly checked the charge. It was low, but it would have to do. She had no time to waste. Just as she was about to move toward the door, Cale returned, his face tense, his eyes scanning the sky. He had heard it too. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. his usual calm replaced by a rare edge of urgency. The Zordians. Alora's mind raced. The Zordians were ruthless, and their elite soldiers, the hunters, were trained to hunt down even the most skilled of warriors. Kyle, for all his strength and survival instincts, was no match for them, and Alora, though skilled in combat, was still recovering from the crash. They needed a plan, and fast. Kyle dropped his pack and moved toward the small table, his movements swift and deliberate. "We need to get to higher ground," he said. "It'll give us the advantage." Alora nodded, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the door. The hum of the ship grew louder. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Not long," Kyle replied. "They'll be here within the hour." The urgency in his voice made Alora's heart race even faster. She had to act quickly. She had faced many battles in her life, but this was different. This was not a fight for a throne, for an empire. This was a fight for survival. Her survival and Kale's. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Together, they moved quickly through the cabin, gathering what little supplies they could carry. Kale grabbed his knife, a crude but effective weapon, and Alora slung the plasma rifle over her shoulder. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As they stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The trees stood tall around them like silent sentinels, but Alora knew that the cover they provided would not last forever. The Zordians had superior technology, and they would track her down eventually. They moved swiftly through the forest, Kale leading the way. Alora followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of the approaching enemy. The trees grew denser the deeper they went, and the ground beneath their feet became uneven, filled with rocks and fallen branches. It was difficult to move quickly, but Kale seemed to know the terrain like the back of his hand. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter as he led her toward the high ground. The hum of the Zordian ship was now unmistakable, growing louder with each passing second. Alora's heart pounded in her chest as she realized just how close they were. They couldn't outrun them. They would have to fight. As they reached a small clearing on the ridge, Kale turned to her. "Stay here," he said. "I'll scout ahead." "No," Alora replied sharply, her voice firm. "I'm not hiding while you fight. I may be injured, but I'm not helpless." Kale gave her a look, a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You're not ready," he said. "You're still recovering. You're not in any condition to fight." "Neither are you," Alora shot back. "But we're in this together. I can help. I've fought wars before." Kyle seemed to consider her words for a moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Fine. Stay close and don't do anything reckless." Alora smiled, a rare expression of confidence breaking through the tension. "Reckless is my middle name." The Zordian ship finally came into view, hovering just above the treetops. A sharp chill ran through Alora's spine as she saw the soldiers drop from the ship, their black armor blending with the shadows of the trees. They were methodical, moving in perfect formation, their weapons drawn and ready. Kale and Alora crouched behind a large rock, watching the enemy soldiers carefully. The hunters were here, and they were searching for her. Alora's fingers tightened around the plasma rifle, her pulse quickening. This was it. The fight she had been dreading, the moment where everything would be decided. "Stay low," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let them pass." But Alora wasn't going to wait for them to find her. This was her battle, and she would fight it on her terms. With a determined look, she raised the plasma rifle, taking aim at the nearest soldier. Kale looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "Alora, wait." But it was too late. She fired. The blast was deafening, cutting through the air and striking the soldier square in the chest. The impact sent him flying backward, his armor sparking as he crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted as the remaining soldiers turned toward them, weapons raised. "Now we fight," Alora said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on the approaching enemy. The battle had begun. The sound of the plasma rifle's blast echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees and sending the Zordian soldiers into chaos. Alora's heart pounded in her chest as she quickly ducked behind a large boulder, her eyes scanning the area for the next target. She could hear the soldiers shouting, their boots crashing through the underbrush as they moved toward her position. But she was ready. This wasn't the first battle she had fought, and it wouldn't be the last. Kael, ever the silent protector, crouched beside her, his knife ready in his hand. He hadn't expected her to strike first, but now that she had, there was no turning back. He moved with precision, his every step calculated. Alora admired his ability to stay calm under pressure, something she had always prided herself on as a queen, but now saw in a new light. This human, who had once seemed so foreign to her, was proving to be just as much of a warrior as any soldier she had ever known. The Zordians, now fully aware of their presence, began to fan out, their black armor making them nearly invisible in the shadows of the forest. They moved in perfect formation, their weapons raised, scanning for any sign of movement. Alora's hand tightened around the plasma rifle, ready to fire again if needed, but Kael motioned for her to wait. "We don't have the luxury of wasting shots," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. "We need to make every shot count." Alora nodded, understanding his words. The Zordians were formidable opponents, and even with the advantage of surprise, they could quickly overwhelm them if they weren't careful. She glanced at Kael, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, an unspoken understanding between them. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by fate. They were allies, warriors, and together they would face whatever came next. The first Zordian soldier came into view, his armor reflecting the dim light filtering through the trees. Alora raised the rifle, her breath steady, and aimed for his exposed neck. With a quick squeeze of the trigger, the blast hit its mark, sending the soldier to the ground in a heap. He never had a chance to cry out, his life snuffed out in an instant. Kael moved silently, his knife flashing as he lunged at the nearest soldier, taking him down with a swift, practiced motion. The Zordian crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his hand. But more soldiers were coming, and Alora knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed a plan, something to turn the tide in their favor. "Kael," Alora whispered, her voice urgent. "We need to retreat. If we stay, here we'll be overwhelmed." Kael glanced at her, his expression hard but understanding. He had seen enough battles to know when to fight and when to run. "There's a ravine to the north," he said, pointing in the direction of a dense thicket. "We can use it to trap them, force them into a confined space. We'll have the upper hand." Alora nodded. It was a risky move, but it was their best shot. She quickly checked the charge on her rifle and followed Kael as he led her through the forest, moving with purpose. They dodged through the trees, staying low and silent, using the natural cover of the forest to their advantage. The Zordians, distracted by their pursuit, didn't see them slip away. As they neared the ravine, Kael stopped and turned to Alora. "We'll need to make a stand here," he said, his voice steady. "If we're quick, we can take them down, one by one." Alora's heart raced. The ravine was narrow, the walls steep, but it would provide them with a perfect vantage point. They would be able to pick off the soldiers as they tried to climb down, using the terrain to their advantage. But they had to be fast. Once the Zordians realized what was happening, they would try to outflank them. Kael handed Alora a sharpened stick, a makeshift spear. "It's not much, but it'll do," he said, his tone apologetic. Alora took the spear, her fingers gripping the rough wood. "It's enough," she said, her voice firm. "Let's end this." The Zordians were close now, their footsteps growing louder as they approached the ravine. Alora could hear their voices, their language harsh and guttural. They were closing in, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was it. They had one chance to make it out alive. As the first Zordian soldier appeared at the edge of the ravine, Alora didn't hesitate. She hurled the spear with all her strength, her aim true. The soldier cried out as the spear lodged deep into his chest and he fell to the ground lifeless. The remaining soldiers froze, momentarily stunned by the sudden attack. Kael took advantage of their hesitation, moving with the speed of a predator. He lunged at the closest soldier, his knife flashing in the dim light. The Zordian never saw him coming, and with a swift strike, Kale drove the blade deep into his enemy's side. Alora's pulse quickened as she aimed her plasma rifle at another soldier, taking him down with a single shot. The remaining Zordians began to retreat, realizing they were being picked off one by one. But their leader, the captain, was not so easily deterred. He motioned for his soldiers to fall back and regroup. "This isn't over," Alora muttered, her eyes fixed on the retreating soldiers. "They'll be back." Kyle nodded, his expression grim. "And when they return, we'll be ready." The two of them stood there watching as the Zordians disappeared into the trees. Alora felt a strange sense of satisfaction. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. She knew the Zordians would return, stronger and more determined than ever. But for the first time since her crash, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had allies now, and she was not alone. "We'll survive," Alora said quietly, turning to Kale. "Together." Kale's lips curved into a rare smile. "Together," he agreed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two of them stood side by side, knowing that the battle was just the beginning. They had faced the enemy and emerged victorious, but much more awaited them. And whatever came, next they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but Alora had found something she hadn't known she was missing. A warrior's spirit in a world she had never expected. And that, she knew, was enough.